Good evening, everybody. My name is Vicky Howarth, and I'm the Social Justice Pastor at Seaforth Baptist Church, and I'm also a member of the Micah Australia Board. So to all of you this evening, on behalf of Seaforth Baptist Church and also Micah Australia, we want to extend a very big welcome to you all to our 2019 Warringah Election Forum. And in meeting here this morning, I want to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which this theatre was built, the Gurungai people, the traditional custodians of this land, who call the wetlands of Manly Lagoon home. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I welcome all Aboriginal people here today. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our candidates for the seat of Warringah this evening, who are going to be joining us on the stage for the panel discussion. This evening we have Kristyn Glanville from the Greens, Dean Harris from the Australian Labor Party, and we have two independents. We have Susan Moylan-Coombs and Zali Steggall. In the run-up to the last two elections in 2013 and 2016, as constituents of the Warringah electorate, we decided as a church to host events which sought to gather the broader Warringah community to come together to discuss important policy issues with our candidate and also with our federal member. So we are deeply honoured by the commitment of those candidates who have prioritised the time to be here tonight to engage with us. Unfortunately, the current member for Parliament, the Honourable Tony Abbott, MP from the Liberal Party, has declined our invitation to attend this evening, as he has done with previous events that we have organised. So Mr Abbott, unfortunately, will not be part of the panel discussion this evening, as he has existing programme commitments. I think we all agree we live in a hurting and complex world. And what brings me here this evening, and perhaps what brings you here too, is a deep desire to live in a world and a nation where there is fairness, justice and compassion. And so as a local church, we decided to host this forum because we wanted to encourage the people who hope to represent us to share our concern and hope for the world's poor, marginalised and oppressed. And importantly, we want to hear from them firsthand on their views of what it means to be a good global neighbour. I think one of the genuinely great benefits of living in a democracy is the opportunity we have to use our voices and raise our concerns for people beyond our shores, but for people who are impacted by the balance of political decisions here in Australia. Democracy is not simply about my needs being met or my rights being respected. Rather, it's about creating communities with the capacity and willingness to care for one another, including our global neighbour. So this is how tonight is going to run. Very shortly, I'm going to be introducing you to the Reverend Tim Costello. He is the Executive Director of Micah Australia, and he's also Chief Advocate for World Vision. I'll then be inviting the candidates to the stage and our moderator for this evening. Our moderator is the Reverend Kristyn Redwood, who is the lead pastor at Seaforth Baptist Church. And whilst there are many social justice issues we could be focusing on this evening to look at our role as a global neighbour and a good global neighbour, we've chosen three areas which reflect some of the policy asks that Micah Australia is posing. Kristyn will be asking each candidate questions linked to Australia's aid spend, Australia's response to the global refugee crisis, and our commitment to addressing climate change. And in order to keep proceedings on track and ensure that each candidate has the right and same amount of time, the first opening remarks is going to be for 2 minutes, and then the questions thereafter, each candidate will have 3 minutes to answer. And then with 15 seconds to go, you will hear the bell, which will hopefully encourage them to wind up. Thank you also to those of you who have submitted questions this evening via our Eventbrite site. They will be being posed, some of those, throughout the evening. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Tim Costello to you. I have the honour of serving with Tim on the Micah Australia board. And Micah is actually a coalition of churches and Christian organisations raising a powerful voice for justice and for a world free from poverty. And Tim is instrumental in ensuring that issues surrounding global poverty are placed on the national agenda. He's one of Australia's best-known community leaders and a sought-after voice on social justice issues, leadership and ethics. So can I ask you, first of all at the back, I think we might need a little bit more light here to be able to see the words, but can you put your hands together for the Reverend Tim Costello?
Well, good evening. It's an absolute delight to have so many of you here tonight. I also acknowledge the Warringah people, and I say on behalf of Micah Australia, it is terrific when our motto is, what does God require of us but to love justice, practice mercy and walk humbly with God, which really takes us to that sense of who are we? What are our duties in the world, and founds it in a spiritual transcendent story. Well, we all know about the global challenges that are facing our world at the moment. We know we're retribalising, we know we're turning inwards, we know that 80 years after the start of World War II, the old gods of blood and soil are back. Blood leads to racism. The sense of fear of others because of the colour of their skin, their ethnicity. And that racism, that fear, that intensity to say we are superior because of our insecurity literally costs lives. The gods of soil lead to nationalism. Nothing wrong with being patriotic. I love Australia, of all places. I cheer and want Australia to win in the Test cricket, preferably without sandpaper. Patriotism is love of place. Nationalism is when that love of place goes another step up and says our place is best, our culture is greater or superior, our way of life is over and above others. We know that that sort of nationalism, whether it's make Russia great again, make America great again, restore the caliphate that Turkey once had in the Ottoman Empire and be great again, this leads to war. And that sense of soil nationalism is very frightening in an interconnected global world. So the question we're posing tonight is, what does it mean to be a good global neighbour? Here in Manly and in Warringah, I understand that there is a great sense of neighbourliness. It's easier when we see someone who's homeless on our street and say, that's one of my mob. Will I give them money? Will I refer them to a housing service? Will I ask the political question, does the state government have enough social housing? We feel an ethical tug. The moral question is, do we feel an ethical tug when it's someone beyond our shore, whether a refugee and displaced, whether someone who has been a recipient of the Australian aid program, whether it is with climate change, other species that aren't simply human? Well, climate change is one of the issues that is clearly on the agenda of being a good neighbour. We've sweltered through the hottest summer on record. March was the hottest March ever. This quarter was the hottest quarter ever. Even in Melbourne, where I live, it got hot. If you wonder where that is, it's a little village just south of Sydney. We certainly know that we are breaking extreme weather records. In fact, some 200 different extreme weather records were broken just over 90 days of this last summer. We are certainly seeing a prevalence of disasters, from fires to floods to droughts to when the rains come, to break the drought, there floods again. And World Vision's work in so many countries is right at the epicentre of this. In the 1970s, we were having 1/7 of the disasters that we're having now. There's little doubt this is driven by climate change. We are seeing here in Australia coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef, increased acidity in our oceans, desertification of our farmable land. When you, live so close to the beautiful beaches of Manly, it is easy to forget that 99.8% of this strait is in drought. And that after a January in which some areas receive the lowest rainfall in 100 years, New South Wales holds the lowest water supply of any state in this nation. So, climate change is a serious problem that will be on our agenda of being global neighbours. We know no one nation can solve this. The profound interdependence of a global world requires interdependent action, and us not giving ourselves a leave pass, but being hopefully leaders. Global climate change, and I travel to so many countries, is already taking the lives of the poorest people. They're in the most marginal land, where the cyclones are often the heaviest and hit with fierce impact. And just a few hundred kilometres away from Australia, we have neighbours fleeing homes because of rising sea levels. So the same floods and droughts we endure here in Australia are being endured around the globe. Earlier this year I was in South Sudan. The conflict certainly has ethnic and cultural origins, but profoundly, that conflict where 2 million South Sudanese have fled over the last couple of years is also driven by climate change. Periods of prolonged drought forcing rural communities to move because they've never seen drought like this. The same argument has been made about the conflict in Syria, now in its 8th year, already costed 600,000 lives. Climate change and a drought. The same argument is made about the caravan so deeply feared by Donald Trump, moving up from Central American states. So I believe that climate change is a moral and a spiritual issue. We often frame it just as an environmental issue, but in my faith, I believe all of creation carries the image of God, all species. And therefore, in creation care, a biblical word for climate change, we actually must act out of spiritual concern if we take our God seriously. Well, when we think about climate change, and this will be discussed on the panel, the question is, are we doing our fair share? Is it enough for us to be shirkers, to be behind the pack, to be putting our short-term benefit first? I fear in the budget handed down last week, we still invested more money in climate pollution than in climate solutions. And I expect this will be discussed tonight in the panel. The second issue about being a good global neighbour is displacement. 1 in every 113 people on the planet are now displaced. That's 31 new people displaced every minute, 44,000 every day. It's now reached an historic high of 68.5 million displaced people. That's more than after World War II. Half of these are children. Of that 65 million, about 23 million are probably refugees. Most of the displaced just want to go home when the conflict ends, when the drought ends. There are some, for fear of religious and political persecution, cannot go home, some 23 million. Well, the greatest burden of the global refugee crisis falls on the low-income countries where World Vision and other agencies are working. Here are the 10 names of the countries that host the most refugees: Turkey, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Lebanon, Iran, Jordan, Kenya, Uganda, Chad. All poor. The only rich nation, really, from the G20 that's in the top 20 of hosting refugees is Germany. In Lebanon, 1 in 6 people is a refugee. In Uganda, where 1 million refugees have fled from South Sudan, I was very moved that the Ugandans haven't closed the border. I was there in January this year. 1 million refugees and they haven't closed the border. Think of that. The Ugandan government gives each 30 by 30 metres of land. World Vision and other agencies give them tools to start planting vegetable gardens and facilities to put up a shack. Those South Sudanese refugees in Uganda, without the border having been shut, are entitled to go to Ugandan schools, poor as they are, Ugandan health clinics, poor as they are. And when I asked the Ugandan leaders, why haven't you shut the border? Why are you so generous? This is what they said to me. Because we were once refugees under Idi Amin. Here is empathy. I think empathy is a mark of being human. I fear if we had a dictatorial government in Australia and we were fleeing on boats, who would take us? Here is an understanding that when it comes to Australia, in the latest figures released by the UNHCR, we rank 25th in the world when it comes to the total number of refugees we host as a proportion of our population. We rank 45th in the world as a proportion of our GDP. And Credit Suisse, a couple of months ago, ranked wealth, not GDP, wealth per nation. And what country came out as number one, the wealthiest nation on the earth, with $261,000 per capita? It's a medium figure. That nation was Australia. We are blessed. But in refugees, 25th on total per capita head, 45th on GDP. A leading Australian politician once said, "It's a good thing that Australia should have earned a reputation for a sensitive understanding of the problems of people in other lands, that we should not come to be regarded as people who are detached from the miseries of the world. I know," he said, "that we will not come to be so regarded, for I believe that there are no people anywhere with warmer hearts and more generous impulses." That was a speech in 1959 by Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies. I wonder what he would think now. We have an international reputation now that's been trashed in terms of our hardness, perceived hardness toward refugees. We have cut our aid to the lowest level ever in our history, at 0.51% under Menzies, now at 0.22%, going down to 0.19% of gross national income. Well, when Micah calls for parties to increase our funding to the UNHCR, we call for an increase from 25 million to 100 million, which we've worked out is Australia's fair share. Again, we're underweight. Again, Robert Menzies, the ghost of Robert Menzies, might be shuddering with watching what the children, his children in the Liberal Party, the Coalition, are doing there. Well, I've talked a little bit about aid. Other countries like the UK and Scandinavian countries and the Dutch all have legislated what is Australia's promise to, 0.7% of gross national income. We're giving just 0.22%, going down to 0.19% after the last budget. It's low, it's shameful, it costs lives, it denies girls an education. It is not who we are. This cutting of aid causes me to ask the question, are we really this mean? How did we become this mean? And I say that because it's not the Conservative tradition. Not only Menzies was aid at its highest when debt was higher and our standard of living much lower, but the Conservative tradition abroad is not to cut aid. David Cameron, when Prime Minister, legislated aid at 0.7% of gross national income. When he was under pressure because the British government debt is 4 times higher than our debt, and we've heard a lot about debt and deficit, he was under pressure to cut aid. David Cameron said, "We will not balance the books on the backs of the poor. Principled leadership, moral leadership of the Menzies tradition. Aid was never a left-right issue. It was always bipartisan. Both sides said, we know the poor, whose lives we save with aid, can't vote. This will be principled. Well, when we look at some of the achievements in aid, we see remarkable achievements. When I started at World Vision 15 and a half years ago, 30,000 kids under the age of 5 died every day from preventable disease, dirty water, not having access to enough calories. Today, 15 and a half years on, it's not 30,000 kids under 5 dying today, it's 15,000 kids under 5 dying today. And we don't get a leave pass where I sometimes hear Australians say, but African mothers, Asian mothers are used to death, they don't feel it in the same way. Let me tell you, an African and Asian mother grieves exactly like an Australian mother when she loses a child. We're 99% on the way to eradicating polio globally, thanks to aid. Only 16 cases in just 2 countries last year. AIDS-related deaths have fallen by 48% since its peak in 2005, when 2 million people died that year from AIDS-related causes, thanks to the world being generous and giving aid. Australian aid has contributed hugely to that global story. We have been a good neighbour. But, unfortunately, the member for Warringah, who's not here tonight, when he was Prime Minister in that first 2014 budget, cut aid by $11 billion over 4 years, really using the aid levels as an ATM. Almost in that budget, and Treasurer Hockey said this, he wanted in that budget, as he addressed it in his speech, Australians to know that it was a good thing. They weren't paying for the cuts, it was the poor paying. Really? Is this who we are? Well, we believe at Micah we are blessed to be a blessing to our global neighbours, that this is profoundly important. Well, I want to conclude by saying tribalisation turning inwards doesn't have to be our story. I believe, and this comes out of my faith, that we are all made in the image of God. For me, the personal challenge in my faith is this: do I see the image of God in people who are not made in my image? Different sexuality, colour of the skin, ethnicity, social caste. Do I see the image of God in someone not made in my image? When we start to think about that, it leads us to the question, what is the imago Australis? What does it mean to bear the image of Australia? Mean-hearted? Tight-fisted? Short-sighted? What is the vision of who we are, as Robert Menzies put it, a generous people, a warm-hearted people. In my book, Faith, I talk about how we fall into the trap of thinking of ourselves and our country as an unassailable ocean liner, charting our own course, pushing other small boats away, keeping others at bay. Well, we may be the only continent nation on earth, but we're still not able to separate ourselves from the great global challenges: climate change, displaced people, the world's poor. When Christchurch massacre happened, we heard a lot of very good statements condemning it. Some bad ones, but mainly from our leaders, fantastic statements. But something struck me. There was a lot of talk about hate and how hate is evil. I was reminded that Gandhi said, we think hate is the enemy. It's not. He said fear is the real enemy. When we're fearful of others, we can start to hate them. Aristotle didn't believe that blacks had souls, so they were suitable to be slaves. Spanish conquistadors didn't think the native Incas and American Indians had souls, though they were suitable for annihilation and to be slaves. When we fear others as not being like us, it leads to enemy pictures. Fear of the other is the real enemy. In my faith, I often hear people say, I've got a strong faith, I don't have doubts. I find myself saying to them, a person who doesn't have doubts doesn't have faith. Doubt for me is the Siamese twin for faith. I have doubt every day. The opposite of faith is not doubt, it's fear. The Bible 365 times says, fear not, be not afraid. Much more than it says, God is love. Fear not, be not afraid. Fear is the opposite of faith. Fear that closes up our heart from compassion. Fear that makes us indifferent to others. Elie Wiesel, who survived the Holocaust, said, hate takes energy. Hate takes action. Hate takes sacrifice. He said, fear and indifference is really the enemy because it doesn't take any energy. Fear and indifference. By being here tonight, I salute you for saying you're not indifferent. You want to face up to the global challenges of being a good neighbour. And for all of us to look into our hearts and see what are the fears of others, the fears that make us turn inwards and not want to be exposed to need in our world, that ultimately denies our full humanity. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim, for sharing your insights and observations and setting the scene for us this evening. It's now time for our moderator and panel to come on the stage. So, Kristyn Redwood from Seaforth Baptist Church, and then we have our candidates, Kristyn Glanville, Dean Harris, Susan Moylan-Coombs, and Zali Steggall. Can I ask you to give them a big round of applause and make them feel welcome? Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. It's wonderful to have you here, and I hope you're looking forward to digging into some of these issues that Tim has raised and hearing from our candidates. My job is to try and keep things moving along, so hopefully I won't need to interrupt too much, but we'll see how we go. So many of us here tonight are from church communities, and as Christians, we believe that we are called to love our neighbours. What do you think it looks like to be a good global neighbour in the Asia Pacific? And Kristyn, I'm going to start with you.
I feel that I've had such extraordinary luck to be born in Australia, but it's completely unearned luck. I kind of rolled the cosmic dice and was born somewhere where I've been able to access an education, been able to get healthcare when I've needed it. And looking at countries around the world, that luck hasn't been shared by others. And so I think we have a moral duty to reflect on the luck that we have, but then pay that luck forward. So I think Australia as a developed country should pay forward that luck, and it should be a positive role model in the region by leading through strong democratic traditions and by looking after our people and our environment. As Tim touched upon, we can't just look internally at our own navels and take this attitude of Australia comes first. I think part of being a good neighbour must be to pull our weight in the world and in the region to pay forward the good fortune that we've had. Part of that, for example, is taking action on climate change, because so many of our neighbours in our region will be vulnerable to things like sea level rise. Australia should also contribute to peace and demilitarisation. Unfortunately, a growing priority of the current government has been to invest more money in war rather than in peace. I think that we have a duty to reprioritise that expenditure, to spend it on things like aid and on building the capacity to resolve our conflicts through peace rather than through buying and building more tanks. So a core to the Greens is an attitude of social justice, looking after the environment and peace and demilitarisation, And I think that those are core principles for how we should look upon our outlook in the region.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Dean Harris, a Labor candidate for Warringah. In response to the first question, I believe there are really four principles that I think about when we consider, or when I consider our place as a good neighbour in a global context. And they're not so different from what it means to be a good neighbour in a genuinely local neighbourhood sense either. I think the starting point is actually respect and acknowledgement, recognition of the humanity in other people, starting from a point of compassion, having an open heart in the way that we approach other people, or in a global sense, other nations. I think we also, and the second point I'd like to make is actually think about when we have a conversation, really seek to understand before we start to impose what we think is the right thing to do on our neighbours. And I think too often in a global context, we might come at problems that we see in other nations with from a point of view of a predetermined outcome, a way of doing things. How would we do it in our country? But I think what we need to do to get the most effective outcomes in working with our global neighbours is to seek first to understand, to recognise cultural and ethnic differences, and to work with people in those nations to find better solutions. I think we also, on occasions, as good neighbours, need to actively promote peace and security, human rights. And sometimes that means saying things to our neighbours that they may not want to hear. Neighbours who perhaps may not have the same values when it comes to respecting the rights of humans within their countries. And whether that be through diplomatic means or in some cases contributing to peacekeeping activities sanctioned by the United Nations, occasionally being a good neighbour does mean standing up for what is right. And the fourth thing I would like to share in terms of my view on being a good neighbour is actually being a good role model, lifting up people out of poverty, punching above our weight in terms of our ability to invest through development aid, countries that need our support to actually create opportunity, to create equity, to create peace and security for their people. And I think as one of the most wealthy nations on the planet, we have an extraordinary opportunity, but also an extraordinary responsibility to do just that.
Warami, Nagaya Susan, Nagaya Grinji Wawunga, Gumida Bianga, Gumida Waranga, Madamarong Tianaga Anaga, Madamarong Balia, Gamaragal Guri Pemble. To love your neighbour as you love yourself was to practice justice towards your fellow human beings. Live generously towards the poor and alien. Do not steal from anyone. Do not be deceptive in dealings with people. Do not oppress or exploit the poor and pay unfair wages. Do not curse the deaf or put stumbling blocks before the blind. Do not be partial to the poor or show favour to the great, but judge honestly. Do not commit financial fraud. Do not hate your brother. Do not seek revenge or hold grudges, but extend forgiveness. Interesting when you put in context of modern Australian history and its treatment of the poor and vulnerable. And what if we use that lens to look at Australia's treatment of the original peoples of this land? But as a good neighbour in East Asia and the Pacific region, Australia has contributed to changing the lives of people in extreme poverty and reduced it from 60% to 4% over the past 30 years. The context for Australia's foreign aid program, and indeed all our international relations, is complex and fast changing. We have our work cut out for us right now, close to home and globally, to hold our own in an increasing contested international arena. Australians are right to expect from us a foreign aid program that makes the best possible uses of our taxes and responds skillfully to a fast-paced, changing world to assist our neighbours.
It's quite amazing to get the opportunity to speak after already so many moving speeches. I agree, the words from Tim Costello are extremely moving. the words of acknowledging that as a woman born in Australia, I'm in a position of so much more privilege and opportunity than so many women in so many other countries around the world. When we look at the question of what does it mean to be a good global neighbour, I think we also have to think, what does it mean to be a good local neighbour? How do we fit into our local communities? Because at the end of the day, how we all want to be treated ourselves and how we hope to treat our neighbours locally should be a reflection of how we treat our neighbours globally and within our own region. There's no doubt that through international development programs, Australia can help our neighbouring countries. In the Asia Pacific, we're to improve the lives of millions of people, for example, by providing better healthcare, clean water, educational opportunities. This is what being a good global neighbour looks like. Part of this is listening, of course, to the needs and hopes of aspirations of our neighbours and assisting them to achieve those aspirations. We should be working on initiatives that are mutually beneficial and improving economic opportunities in our region, globally, and around the world. Safety and happiness for Australians and our neighbours. We can think bigger than what we currently are. The impacts of climate change, particularly changes associated with the increases in temperature and the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, they pose a real threat to all countries in our region in particular, and our national security. Climate change has the potential to increase the health and the problems and spread diseases and disrupt critical infrastructure in Australia and in our neighbouring countries in the Asia Pacific. Our societal resilience and communities' ability to respond and recover to increasing natural disasters will be pushed to their limits. The Australian Climate and Health Alliance 2017 framework for a national strategy on climate, health and wellbeing for Australia highlighted that changes in weather patterns may threaten our security and quality of water sources and the productivity of major agricultural regions in Australia, with implications for ensuring food and water security for growing populations. Those problems are real for our global neighbours just as much as for us.
Thank you for your answers. We're going to go into a bit more detail around foreign aid. So many of us here think, like Tim outlined, that to be a good global neighbour means having a strong Australian aid program. Can you each tell us if this program is important to you and or your party? And if you would support increasing the current foreign aid budget by the end of the next parliamentary term, what financial commitment can you give? And Dean, we're going to begin with you this time.
Thank you. Look, I'm very proud to represent a party that sees our foreign aid effort as absolutely central to our role as being a good nation and a good global citizen. Under the previous Labor government, our commitment to foreign aid increased every year, year on year, peaking at 0.35% of our gross national income the last full year that Labor was in government. And as Tim pointed out in his speech, what we have seen from the very early days of the current Abbott, Morrison, Turnbull governments is a declining commitment to foreign aid, dropping in the previous year to about 0.22% of gross national income, and I think on the latest budget are down to 0.19%. And so that's a truly appalling state of affairs that, as I said in my opening remarks, that a country by many measures is one of the most wealthy and prosperous in the world, has shirked its responsibility and stepped back from playing a more active role in providing development support to nations in need. My party's commitment is very clear. We aspire to return our level of investment as a nation in foreign aid to a level of 0.5%. We have made a commitment that we will increase foreign aid as a proportion of gross national income year on year, as we did in the previous time that we're in government. And so we want to go not just back to where we were when we were last in government, but well beyond that, and make sure that we resume our role as a country that punches above its weight in supporting developing nations. So that's really our commitment, and as I said, I think it's very central to how the Labor Party sees its role and it sees the role of our nation in that broader global context.
My position would be, as we face humanitarian and development challenges in the near and immediate region, things will only continue to change because of climate, combined with the following recognition that aid is an important investment in Australia's national interest, and we need to do it better. Despite a stagnant budget, there has been some big commitments in the Pacific region, who is our neighbour. Some of our global neighbours, farther away, as Asia and Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Bangladesh, India, Nepal and Pakistan, have had the budgets cut in the aids that we provide, and Pakistan being the worst. As our new Pacific initiative, there is around the new Australian Infrastructure Financial Facility will push for a total Pacific commitment to up for 1.4 million or 35 of Australia's total aid program. And I think that that reflects what is going on in the Pacific at the moment, and we need to maintain what's happening there. So we need to build upon Australia's approach to aid and its effectiveness. We need to restore the aid budget and focus on ensuring that we have a close relationship with partner governments, strong analysis of country needs and the aid's investment plans, through design of individual aid investment, careful selection of implementing partners, a regular monitoring and evaluation of the performance of individual investment and implementing partners, reporting a candid and transparency in areas where we need to do better. When we identify problems, we work with our partners to improve the situation. There is an essential part of building trust and long-term trust and getting the development in the partnership right. We need help to mitigate the effects of conflict and with peace as well.
There's no doubt that aid is important as it provides much needed assistance for countries in need to deal with countries in need, to help them deal with their humanitarian and development challenges. Now, it's important to remember what we're doing locally. A concrete example of that is Warringah-based charity Australian Doctors International. Their head office is in Seaforth, and a substantial portion of their funding comes through our foreign aid program, and that enables them to deploy volunteer doctors and health coordinators to improve healthcare in Papua New Guinea. Now, foreign aid also serves Australia's security and national interests as it improves conditions for refugees in our region, so the incentive for people to try and reach Australia is removed. Targeted aid can work to increase legal protections in our region for refugees, and so they have better support and better rights. Our aid budget under the coalition government has reached an all-time low. When it comes to aid generosity, as measured as a proportion of GDP, we're at 0.23% or 0.23% of GNI, dropping us to the 19th donor in the world. We're well below OECD average, and we don't meet the UN's commitment of 0.7% of GDP. As an independent for Warringah, I would commit to applying pressure on the government of the day to reversing the downward trend in our aid budget, with an emphasis on targeted aid for our region, not just the Pacific, but Asia as well, so that we can maintain our moral authority and presence in the region. Now, it's important to look as an independent what are the parties offering when it comes to aid, because a lot can be said prior to an election. Now, I know the Greens propose that an incremental increasing of Australia's aid budget to reach a target of 0.7% of GDP by 2030. Labor came to government in late 2007, promising to fulfil an election commitment to increase Australians' foreign aid to 0.5% of GNI by 2015-16. Now, the target of foreign aid of 0.5% of GNI by 2015-16 remained in place for Labor's first 4 budgets, but by 2012-13, Labor had deferred the target by 1 year to 2016-17 to assist with returning the budget to surplus. A second delay by 2017 and 18, detailed in Labor's last budget of 2013-14, saved $1.9 billion over 4 years. The goalposts in aid keep moving. Finally, in its pre-election economic statement in August 2013, Labor had saved another $966 million in foreign aid spending over 4 years. Now, there has been a commitment by Penny Wong has vowed to increase development assistance as a percentage of national income, but there is very little detail and timing around when that's due to happen.
Can I just interrupt you there, and we'll come back to that point in our discussion. Okay, let's go to Kristyn.
I always find it amusing that when it comes to sporting competitions, Australia is super competitive. We just can't walk away from a competition unless we're winning. But when it comes to the foreign aid Olympics, it's crickets. As Zali has helpfully noted, the Greens' policy is to increase our commitment to 0.7% of gross national income by 2030. This would bring us in line what I see as being our international contemporaries. It would mean that we can hold our head high in terms of foreign aid compared to countries like the UK, the Netherlands and Denmark. And it would also ensure that we're meeting our United Nations obligations. The Parliamentary Budget Office has costed our policy at an additional $10 billion over forward estimates. And for the reasons that have been highlighted about national security and our ethical duties, I think that this is an entirely fair and reasonable commitment in terms of our outward outlook at the world and sharing the prosperity that we enjoy in this country. To re-emphasise the idea of aid as being central to the Australian government and what it does, the Greens would support reinstatement of the Minister for International Development and the Pacific, rather than having foreign aid as something in a back pocket, in a sort of a dark room in a shadow. Junior minister's ministry. It should be a central part of how our government is thinking about international relations. And I think that it's not really a coincidence that our aid levels are at historic lows. As I foreshadowed before, we've been spending at historic highs on military spending, way out of step with our historic spending, despite the fact that our threat from the global threats is no greater than it has been at previous historic times. So I think that we can sensibly decrease this spending in line with historical spending on military and instead deploy it to things like aid, which can build peace, but without bloodshed and warfare, which only creates more humanitarian issues in the long term.
So picking up on Zali's point, and I noticed that you said the word aspire. Labor aspires to 0.5% of gross national income, the foreign aid budget. My question is Labor going to commit to providing a timetable as to how that increase would be achieved?
Well, we haven't specified a timetable at the moment because we need to assess the state of the budget and the state of our other responsibilities before we can lock in on a commitment. I'm a bit confused about some of Zali's numbers, though, quoting budget figures from 2016-17 when Labor wasn't actually in government, so you might need to clarify that. But I also find it curious that somehow we can make significant financial commitments and at the same time support big tax loopholes for the most wealthy people in Australia. It's not magic pudding economics. We actually have to be economically responsible. We need also to develop the political capital within Australia to be able to deliver that level of commitment moving forward. We've seen what's happened when you don't have the political capital for these things. Governments get voted out. And so politics is the art of the possible. We're committed to the trajectory that I spoke about, a commitment to increase that aid year on year to a target of 0.5% within the foreseeable future. We've done it before. The evidence was the last time we were in government, a year-on-year increase to 0.35% the last full year that we're in government. So I sit here proud of our record on foreign aid and confident that we'll be able to continue that trajectory if we are returned to government after the election.
So if you were returned to government or if you were elected, would Labor then give a more detailed commitment once they knew what the landscape looked like?
I'm absolutely certain once we are in government and we can actually look at all of the priorities that we need to deliver. In Chris Bowen's first budget, I'm certain there'll be a clearer timetable over which time frame we'll actually reach that target. But sitting here at the moment, not in government, what we're outlining is an aspiration and a commitment for year-on-year increases to reach that target.
And Zali and Susan, you both said you supported or wanted to restore the foreign aid budget, but neither of you set a target. What do you think is the right amount to give?
I'll go first. I agree with the target of we need to at least move up to a 0.5%. That is a commitment that ironically was a bipartisan commitment some time ago, but seems to be a moving target as I think the various parties decide on different priorities. I know Mr Costello were probably slightly frustrated in the description of how aid gets looked at as being the budget ATM, that as soon as a government of the day wants to look at cuts, it's by looking at the aid budget that it decides to make it. And I think that's really disappointing. I think we are more than that as Australian, as a nation. We're capable of better. I think it is ultimately, there's a level of self-interest involved in focusing on our Australian aid abroad, because it does need to form part of our overall climate change strategy. It will have an impact when it comes to national security and climate change. And so I think we should be aiming to at least meet the target of 0.5%.
I think that internationally we should start to get more in alignment with what other countries are doing. The OECD has been talking about, well, we have been talking about how we can start to increment and do it over a period of time, because I think that there is great stresses on the budget and we need to be able to do it that cares for other people, but also protect what needs to go on in this country as well. So I would do it incrementally, raising it from 0.1 up to 0.5 over a period of time.
Thank you. And this kind of leads into a question that comes from the floor. If charity supposedly begins at home, what rank in terms of policy priority should be given to foreign aid? So obviously we're talking about foreign aid today, so you'll have to answer the question. But I guess, how important is it to you or your party in terms of priorities? Anybody can answer this question?
I think foreign aid is an important part of the Greens' world outlook. A core principle to us is the idea of peace and demilitarisation. And part of how we achieve peace is through aid. As Tim foreshadowed, a lot of what drives warfare and conflict between ethnic groups is resource scarcity. So if we can be part of contributing to the solution globally, to ensuring that people have a safe place to live near their homes, it takes pressure off other things like national security, because people are content at home and there's less warfare. And so to me, part of security at home is security abroad. I think it's one of many priorities though, and so that is why our policy is to incrementally increase it over time. But I think that it's something that we should look as something of a matter of national pride, that Australia is pulling its weight internationally in terms of foreign aid efforts.
From my perspective, I think it's as important as other international programs, whether that be in regard to defence or trade. It creates an opportunity for us to build stability in the world, to create greater security, less conflict, which therefore means less displaced people. And we know that that's a real challenge for the world overall. It's, as Tim pointed out, it's one of the biggest levels of displacement that the world has ever seen. And so it's a global priority, which must make it a top priority for us as a wealthy, developed nation to do more than we have done in the past to contribute to addressing that problem. And it goes also for climate change. As a nation that's incredibly wealthy and technically capable, we can do much, much more than we have done over the last 5 to 6 years in addressing climate action and being a world leader on that stage. So I would like us to take that mantle. I keep using the term punch above our weight, but we've done that in so many different spheres of our international endeavours in the past, whether it's on the sporting field or whether it's even been in times of conflict. And as an Australian, I expect and want our nation to feel that we can make that contribution in regard to this important issue of foreign aid and development support.
Another question from the audience, which anyone can answer. Is there a link between foreign aid and foreign policy? To what extent should they be independent of each other? Does anyone want to have a go with that?
No one wants to.
No. Look, I think they are to an extent linked, but at the moment really dealt with separately as well in government. The reality is our foreign policy has to take into account a number of factors, whether it comes to national security issues and where we are and where our trading partners and our security partners are in the world. Of course, when it comes to our Australian aid abroad, it does take into account those national security priorities. And there has been a lot of focus on it. In his maiden speech in Parliament in 2008, Scott Morrison said, "The new government has committed to continue to increase investment in foreign aid, and I commend it for doing so. However, we still must go further. If we doubt the need, let us note that in 2007, the total world budget for global aid accounted for only 1/3 of basic global needs in areas such as education, general health, HIV/AIDS, water treatment and sanitation." Now, the Coalition's budget just last week indicated a modest increase for the next financial year, but then the budget is set to decrease by 11.8% by 2022-2023. That sets a real question of how does it sit with our foreign policy, and maybe the lack of foresight as to the links between our foreign policy and the stability of our region and the impact our foreign aid will have on that.
Okay. We're just going to cut it there, but I'm going to ask you the next question. But we're going to the next topic of the night. We know each of the parties and candidates have differing views on Australia's border protection and immigration policies. But moving beyond just our border policies, we want to talk tonight about what Australia can do as a nation to more broadly help address the global refugee crisis that Tim spoke about. Could you outline for us your party or your own positions as to how your foreign policy might construct new diplomatic solutions to this global issue? And Susan, we'll begin with you.
Global warming caused by human activity is already having a major impact on our planet and is likely to make parts of the world uninhabitable, leading to migration, displacement and planned relocation. Understanding migration in the context of climate change is not easy. There is a fundamental dilemma of how simultaneously work to mitigate effects of climate change while at the same time preparing for the consequences of the lack of mitigation. It is, of course, more difficult to determine the role played by climate change in a specific situation, given the interplay of politics, social, demographic and economic factors. Planning for a new pattern of resettlement should be a high priority. It's becoming clear that resettlement policies in the traditional destination countries like Australia, we need to do a refresh. We see the hardening attitudes of certain sectors of our community because they don't see the opportunity of migration. Part of that comes from the fact that people only see migration as a bad thing. Sometimes they see it as a good thing and they link that to highly skilled people coming in. But highly skilled people are more likely to come and settle and then get recruited elsewhere. The long-term solution is to extend our hand out to people now. The payoff is that their children will succeed and those children will build the next generation of lawyers, doctors and create prosperity in Australia. After World War II, our migration policy that was imperative to the post-war reconstruction that my grandfather, Dr. H.C. Coombs, was head of, we saw the Australian population grow within the wide Australia policy. Today we must acknowledge that we are part of Asia and we must truly embrace diversity, culture, religion and people of colour because they are our neighbours. One of the impending issues for Australia is the location and close proximity to Papua New Guinea, to the Torres Straits and our border security threats. There is a back door that's open. Couple this with the potential of displacement communities from the Torres Strait region due to climate events and sea level risings, we have an issue. As a First Nations woman, traditionally, our borders were always open. We always warmly welcomed people into our homelands, hence the welcome to country practice. We passionately cared for people when they came in, and we provided for their physical and spiritual well-being whilst in country.
I think there's a lot that we've overlooked from the traditional practices of the traditional owners of the land. We need to work towards more cooperation and responsibility, sharing on refugee issues. It's time we began setting a positive example with policies aimed at enhancing rather than restricting access to protection of refugees, both regionally and globally. We can look at a few things. Engaging more constructively with countries in Asia to reduce the demand for refugees to come to Australia. We need to improve conditions and rights for refugees in our region by providing access for safety to refugees in Asia and countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, by negotiating better conditions for refugees through targeted aid, by larger and more responsive refugee resettlement programs, both from Australia and other wealthy nations in our region. At the moment, our resettlement intake for 2018 and 19 is 18,750. Now, we have the resources and capacity to significantly increase this. Now, Labor has committed to increasing this to 27,000 by 2025. I think we need to be cautious about setting targets because we need to have the ability to be flexible, to meet resettlement needs and intakes, to cater when global events occur and people have to be resettled. It needs to be flexibility in our approach, and it needs to be humanitarian. There needs to be more funding for UNHCR. The experts tell me there's an appetite for this in the region, and both the Indonesian and Malaysian governments have signalled a willingness to work towards these solutions. In the longer term, we need to work with countries in our region to develop an effective regional processing framework that can ensure refugees can access protection without risking their lives, and that requires a systematic process where agreements across states in our region to buy in and offer resettlement places and to afford protection to both asylum seekers awaiting processing and for those found to be refugees. A single centralised system for processing claims that could be run by the UNHCR or a new regional body, where people would be subject to the same procedures and the same rights, no matter which country they're in, and they can be found to be refugees, and then they go to a centralised pool to be resettled across participating countries. There should be no nexus between where you made your asylum claim and which country you end up being settled in. So a person who applies for asylum in Indonesia would have the same chance of ending up in Australia as one who applies for asylum here. The rationale is that it would take away the incentive for making any dangerous journeys to Australia.
To me, this is a really personal topic because I'm what Peter Dutton refers to as an un-Australian lawyer who has assisted asylum seekers who have been brought to Australia from Nauru and fought to prevent them from being returned there. The conditions on Nauru are deplorable. It's really clear that we need to rethink how we're dealing with the refugee crisis. I think also we need to think holistically about what has driven people to come to Australia by boat. And I've spoken firsthand to asylum seekers who have travelled through countries like Indonesia and Malaysia and spoke about the way that they've been exploited and experienced poverty in those countries, which then meant that desperate people are then enticed to make dangerous journeys to come to Australia. I think we need to have a regional solution to these things, and part of that policy is that the Greens would support investing through the UNHCR to improve the capacity of countries in our region, like Malaysia and Indonesia, and other countries that are near the countries experiencing displacement, to improve their capacity to support refugees while their claims are processed, and ensure that they have a dignity package where they can access healthcare and education and work permits and have some dignity rather than living in inadequate camps. Part of our outlook on refugees also has to be considering our foreign policy. Australia has contributed to the refugee crisis in some degree through our foreign policy of military intervention in the Middle East, which has then created, power vacuums that players like ISIS have created power vacuums that players like we'll see. It's created a power vacuum through our foreign policy and contributing to warfare in the Middle East that's then in turn generated a refugee crisis from those countries. So the answer has to be both regional, but also has to be thinking holistically about what's generating refugee crisis. The Greens' commitment would be to increase our refugee intake from its current levels at 18,750 per year to 50,000 places a year. And although that sounds like a large number, it would only amount to less than 0.14% of the Australian population.
There are a number of very specific things that Labor's committed to address this continuing and increasing challenge of how we address the need for people to seek asylum. And I'll talk about those briefly, but I think the principal approach needs to be one of actually engagement with the region. To put the walls up, to pretend that we can manage this ourselves, I think undermines the reality of the situation, that we need to work with our neighbours, our partners in the region to actually identify bilateral, multilateral solutions that allow us to treat people seeking asylum humanely, to provide them with safety, to provide them with security, with education, with access to the things they need until they can be safely resettled back to their home countries. So our commitments are firstly to increase our humanitarian intake. You've heard that already. We will increase our annual intake to 27,000 people per year. And we think it is appropriate to have a target in this case. It is, I think, as we've done with things like gender representation in the Parliament, we need to be clear about what we're seeking to achieve. And given our ability, given our capacity, we think 27,000 in the first year of Labor government thereafter is an appropriate setting. In addition to that, we're proposing to allow 5,000 community-sponsored humanitarian visas, which would allow community organisations, even local governments, to actually sponsor people through a humanitarian program and to provide support and integration assistance for those people when they come to our country. We have committed to increasing funding through the UNHCR to develop some of more effective and efficient means of processing asylum claims for asylum at countries of departure within our region. That 500 million commitment is over 5 years, so about 100 million a year to actually help the UNHCR deal with the rising challenges that the mass displacement the world is facing is creating for them. And I guess more broadly, I think, again, it comes back to our role of ensuring that we can continue to have security and strong borders, but not lose our humanity in the process. Again, this is a matter of political capital that under the previous Labor government we did see people making treacherous journeys to our nation by boat, and we don't want to see that happen again. And so we've got a clear commitment to maintain an orderly approach to immigration while at the same time doing much, much more to ensure that we treat people seeking asylum with humanity and dignity.
So, Tim, let me just get this right. When you were speaking before, you were talking about that Micah was asking that the government increase the funding for supporting the UNHCR program. So it's like supporting the camps from 25 million to 100 million?
To 100 million, yeah. And it's not a Micah position, but certainly World Vision has worked out a per capita GDP fair humanitarian intake in terms of what's happening around the world, and Australia's is 42,000. So I'm thrilled that Labor have committed to 27,500 plus 5,000 community sponsorship. It's getting up there, that's 32,000, but on any fair reckoning, 42,000, it would be Australia's fair burden. That's quite separate to immigration levels. There's a whole debate going around immigration. We learnt a new term about a per capita recession we're technically in, but for immigrants coming in, we wouldn't be in growth and prosperity, but in a recession. Very interesting to me that often our immigration program does cherry pick the brightest and the best, whose education has been paid by poor countries, who actually would make it in those poor countries anyway. Those poor countries do need those skills too, because it's a brain drain when we take them. So we get their skills at the cost of those poor countries. Now, they have rights to apply, and I don't want to limit human freedom to say there's a better life in Australia than, say, Zimbabwe as a doctor, to be a doctor in Australia for my kids. But it seems to me that we should unpick the overall levels of immigration from the humanitarian debate and say our fair share is at least 42,000, and on it, UNHCR up from 25 million, again fair share to 100 million.
So Zali, you were a little bit hesitant about setting a target, and I guess it depends on, as you said, what's going on at the time. Tim spoke about that we have historically high global refugee crisis. So do you have any idea, like a rough idea about what you think is the right number to take in?
Well, no, because as Tim's just pointed out, the calculation is actually much higher than what's being proposed. And I should say, because the difficulty with targets is when they become restrictive. Because if the circumstances of our neighbouring countries change, and no one has a crystal ball as to what may well happen in the future, and there's certainly a number of conflicts that are displacing huge numbers of people. And we've already heard about what share we're taking of that, of responsibility in relocation and resettling people. My concern is when we start putting a limit, we start really limiting exactly. If it's a limit which is a minimum goal, then that's one thing. But if it's a target because we're not intending to exceed it, regardless of world circumstances, then I have a concern that we're really not meeting our moral and ethical duty to our neighbours.
And Susan, I might have missed it, but did you have a target or a goal that you think is appropriate for Australia?
Oh, look, as an independent, and if I was lucky to be elected, sitting on the crossbench, I wouldn't have the power to be setting policy and targets, and that would be for the government of the day. But certainly in terms of representing the people of Warringah and looking at the migration and the refugee status of people coming in, I would hope that we would be compassionate and kind. And I think separating out the refugee status to migration, that they're the things that we need to look at. So certainly representing the electorate in things that are important for us on the crossbench, that's what I'd be doing.
So picking up on Zali's point, is the target the minimum, or is it like the goal, or can you take more?
Well, I think like all of these things, we would review it over time. It's a target sitting here today in opposition. It's what we feel is an achievable number, is the right number for where we sit as a nation today. Personally, I'd love it to be far higher than that, but we need to be pragmatic. We need to, again, as I said in your earlier question, assess the situation when we come into government, and I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to revise it according to the needs of our nation and the needs of our neighbours in the future.
And did any of you talk about the actual giving to the UNHCR? Like, how much money do you think is appropriate? So Tim has said maybe we could move it up to 100 million instead of 25 million. Do the Greens have a policy of what they think is appropriate?
Yes, the Greens' position would be to invest 500 million over 4 years. So I think that actually exceeds the 100,000 a year that Tim has suggested.
Does anyone else have a policy or target on that?
I think, again, I would reflect what Susan was saying. As an independent, the reality is working with the government of the day. But what we do need to do, and I think that's the benefit of a strong independent crossbench, is holding the government to account and the major parties to account on pre-election promises and indications, and making sure that there is the delivery of the kind of support and budget measures that are needed.
And we'll come back, we're going to have general discussions later, so I am conscious that we haven't talked about Manus Island or offshore detention, but we'll come back to that later. But we're going to move to our third area for tonight. Humans are having a massive influence on our environment. Climate change is already having an impact on those living in poverty. What is your sense of urgency when it comes to the threat of climate change? And how will you show leadership in Australia to ensure we achieve our commitments under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Climate Agreement? And Zali, we'll begin with you.
Well, I've certainly made no secret that that's a major policy platform for me in this election. It's what's driven me to stand as an independent candidate for Warringah. As a mother, I am compelled to make sure that we have a better future for our children and the next generations. Now, the majority of Australians, as I do, believe that it's time that Australia finally acted with conviction on climate change. Now, as we all know, we're experiencing the serious effects of climate. Currently, we are not on track to meet our Paris targets in the Paris Agreement. We are on track for a 4-degree world. Now, that is not a world we want to be in. Climate change is our greatest national security threat. A world of 2 degrees will have serious effects on surrounding countries' ability to support their own population. Island nations around the Pacific have, for several years now, been raising the alarm of sea level on the rise. With no action on climate, there's a risk of massive surge and asylum seekers that will stress our borders and our ability to govern. Domestically, climate change will have severe effects on our own population, with reduced rainfall and its effects on drinking water to droughts affecting our own production. Despite all the severity of these risks, there's been a complete lack of bipartisan agreement to date on what action Australia should take. As an independent, I want to lead the way and ensure that we do take strong action. There's a high level of urgency and the need to respect what the science is telling us. It's been tested and accepted by very credible and economic agencies in the world. The IPCC tells us that for us to, the global average temperatures have already risen by 1 degree, and we're likely to rise by 1.5. At this level, there's already going to be serious climate effect. But the experts are saying that for us, if we reduce global emissions, as Labor has proposed, by 45% by 2030 on 2005 levels, that will still only give us a 50-50 chance of keeping global warming below the 1.5 degree threshold. Given the risks, I'm not satisfied that a 50-50 chance is good enough. We have to get a consensus for faster action. The most important step, I believe, is to authorise a credible climate authority to take action and advise and set that course for Australia and its long-term plan. If Australia is to be part of the global response to global warming, we need to take action across multiple industries, from energy, transport, construction, agriculture, forestry, mining and mineral processing. All of these industries need to do more research, investment and the use of new technologies for us to move ahead.
Climate change is such a threat to our security, but also the response to climate change provides us with so many opportunities to think differently about energy and about how we power our world. So I'm really excited to be running for the Greens in this election, where we have a vision for what energy looks like in the future. Our goal is to have 100% renewable electricity generation in Australia. It sounds ambitious, but already the market is on track to deliver 78% by 2030. So I believe we should feel confident to aspire beyond what the market can deliver alone, but actually take world leadership in building up renewable energy domestically, but also as a superpower, exporting renewable energy through things like hydrogen power. The Asia-Pacific region is vulnerable to climate change, and so I think it's a moral duty for us to take action and to pull our weight, and also to acknowledge the elephant in the room with climate change, which is that although Australia may not be the biggest carbon emitter in the world, but contributes globally to this problem by exporting coal to India and China, where it contributes to the emissions overseas. So part of our response to climate change must be to phase out thermal coal. The Greens' policy is that we should phase this out by 2030 and have a transition plan so that communities in places like the Hunter Valley aren't going unemployed, but there's a transition for them to be engaged in other forms of employment. I think that there's an economic argument for this. The microphone really hates me tonight. There's an economic argument for these sorts of visionary policies. Even companies like BP have conceded that peak fossil fuels will happen before 2040. So I think that there's an economic imperative for us to be forward-looking in terms of what we think the future of energy will look like. And to me, solar is such an exciting opportunity because at the moment our energy is determined by big fossil fuels companies who own big coal-fired power plants. In a diversified energy market where anyone in this room can buy a solar panel and have financial support to invest in a community solar garden or install panels on their homes, I think that that's an important democratisation of energy where everyone can participate in the electricity market. So I'm really proud to be bringing this platform forward in this election. The Greens will hopefully hold balance of power in at least one House of Parliament, and will be pushing whichever party forms government to take strong action on climate change and to have real leadership and ambition in addressing these problems.
I won't restate the need for urgent climate action. I think Zali and Kristyn have articulated that well. For me, this is the reason that I'm actually sitting here tonight. 5 years ago, I was aghast at Mr Abbott wanting to repeal an effective price on carbon introduced by the previous Labor government, a price on carbon that saw our emissions fall over the period of time that it was introduced. Since then, we've seen continuously increasing greenhouse gas emissions in this country. And we have so many opportunities to actually get that heading in the other direction that it's not funny. Our comprehensive and sensible approach to urgent climate action is something that I'm very proud to share with you tonight. And it starts by turning Australia into a renewable energy superpower. We're proposing through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to double its original investment of $10 billion, give it another $10 billion to invest in large-scale renewable projects and firming technologies that we need to transition away from coal-fired forms of power. We also need to modernise our grid, so there's a $5 billion modernisation contribution to create renewable zones that allow us to connect those renewable supplies effectively and efficiently into our electricity network. We're also going to work with households. We have a household battery program. Already 2 million households in Australia have solar panels on their roofs. They've already made capital investment to harness renewable energy. And we can, through a means-tested subsidy, boost the number of homes that have battery technology, allowing that existing investment to produce energy that can be used longer through the day and again reduce our reliance overall on fossil fuel-based forms of energy. We're going to boost our transport sector in terms of transitioning it to clean energy. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion in the media over the last couple of days about our electric vehicle target, that we want all new vehicle sales in Australia, not all, sorry, getting ahead of ourselves, 50% of all new vehicle sales in Australia to be electric vehicles by the year 2030. We also want to introduce more stringent vehicle emission standards in line with other modern economies such as the United States. and to work with manufacturers and retailers to make sure that if we are looking at hybrid or combustion engine cars, that they are emitting lower levels of pollution. We want to kickstart our hydrogen economy using renewable energy to create hydrogen, transform that into liquid ammonia and be able to export that to growing economies like Japan and Korea that are already well on track to transforming their transport sectors to hydrogen. And there are a number of other things that I don't have time to go into given the time constraints, but I will say we also believe in creating an independent authority to oversee and monitor and track our progress on our emission targets. So unlike Mr Abbott, who cut funding to the Climate Change Authority, Labor will reinstate its funding and have it resume its place as our guide and our oversight toward our climate action targets. Thank you.
So I feel like I'm talking a lot about targets. Did I miss you?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
That's all right, it's getting late. So the sense of urgency and the biggest risk for us today and into the future is extreme weather events, and that's floods and storms, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, major natural disasters like earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions and geomagnetic storms, massive incident of data fraud and theft, large-scale cyber attacks, human impacts, environmental damage and disaster, oil spills, radioactive contamination, large-scale involuntary migration, major biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, terrestrial and marine, water crisis is going to be very big in the future. To achieve our commitments under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Climate Agreement, we need to educate people about their environment and our human impacts. Climate change, greater public awareness, public participation and public access to information will change our individual and our collective behaviours, and that's what's needed. Australia and our neighbours, the Pacific Island countries, formally stated that climate change remains the single greatest threat to the well-being of people in the Pacific. We are already mainstreaming climate and disaster resilience into aid investment, especially in the Pacific, but we need to do more to support our neighbours. Too many pieces of paper. Because its influence on the welfare of people of Asia Pacific, the urgency to curb global warming is very high. Some developing countries in the islands are threatened by sea level events. There may be the need to carry out large-scale exodus. Rising temperatures as a result in the decrease in clean water supply, increased erosion and flooding of the coast, whitened corals, decrease in the numbers of fish in open seas, and much more is coming. We need to change the way we live. We need to change the way we do business. And we need to do what others are not doing. We don't need to look through the lens of GDP, because that's what got us to this place. We need to look through the lens of the triple bottom line, measuring everything we do, caring about the effects on our humanity, on the environment, and then profits after. In the Paris Agreement, it acknowledges that climate change is a common concern for humankind. Countries should, when talking about action to address climate change, need to respect and promote and consider their respective obligations on human rights. The right to health, the right of Indigenous people, local communities, migration, children, persons with disability and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to develop as well as gender equality, empowerment of women and intergenerational equality. All of these things motivate the work that I do, locally, nationally and internationally. As a First Nations woman, we don't need policies to guide us. 80,000 years of culture taught us how to live sustainably. Just ask us.
So I believe Australia has committed to around 26 to 28% targets by 2030 for emission reductions. Do you think those targets should be higher? And if so, we'll just quickly go around the panel. Can you tell me what you think the target should be for our emission reductions? Susan, I'll start with you.
Emission reductions, we should just zero it.
Is that 100%? 100%. Yep, Zali?
Well, I think we have to be realistic about managing the process. It has to be an orderly retirement of coal and an exponential, I think, we want to see that increase into renewables and investment into innovation. I think look, from the IPCC, the 45% target is certainly better than the coalition target when it comes to 26 to 28% on 2005 levels by 2030. But as I said, that's a 50-50 chance of reaching the outcome we need. I think aspirationally we need to look at stronger targets and more in line with around 60%.
As I explained, our target's clear. It is 45%. And we think at this point in time that's in line with the IPCC recommendations, but also it's mindful that this is a massive change to the shape of our economy, and we're talking about 11 years to actually go from rising emissions to reducing them by 45%. So we need to be careful about that. I've talked a few times about, political capital. We need to bring people with us on this journey. And while these are noble aspirations of zero net emissions tomorrow, it's just not politically or practically possible. We're committing, aside from refunding the Climate Change Authority, to triennial reviews of our emission reduction targets. And so as new data comes in, as new science comes in, if they need to be raised or lowered, then we'll have the Climate Change Authority advise us on that. So again, it's about depoliticising climate. We don't want the climate wars to continue. We actually want a bipartisan approach to solving this problem. And it's only our opponents, the current government, that want to use this issue to continue to divide and disrupt effective climate action. So we're not going to wait for them though. We will get on with the job if we can't reach that bipartisan approach. But as I said, we think it's a sensible approach, a measured approach, and one that's designed to bring our nation and the community along with us.
The Greens project from if our policies were to be implemented, it would achieve a minimum 62% reduction in emissions by 2030. Our view is that Australia should aim to be carbon neutral, and our target for that would be carbon neutral by 2040. So we're offsetting our emissions from industries where it's not possible at this point in time to stop these emissions from happening. For something like, we can stop burning coal and instead build solar panels, but there are some other industries where the investment needed to address things like the carbon emissions from producing concrete or the carbon emissions from coking coal will require some more time and more investment. So we consider it should be carbon neutral, but we think 2040 is a realistic time frame for that.
So this is a question from the audience, which anybody can answer. Livestock or meat production contributes more to greenhouse gases than transportation, yet all the policy statements talk about solar panels or opposing coal mining or new technology in clean energy, clean transport and renewables. Should we be examining our meat production as well?
I'll tackle that first if you like. So I didn't get a chance to go through all of our climate-related policy initiatives, but one of them is to actually bolster the carbon farming initiative, which was created by the Labor government when we were last in power. And that's really about providing incentives for landowners to actually sequester carbon through reforestation and planting. And we've seen massive loss of habitat under the current government. And aside from the impacts on biodiversity, it has a massive impact on climate as well. And so when you talk about farming and animal production and the necessity for farmers to clear land to support ever-increasing numbers of cattle, we'd like to work with the agricultural industry to actually bring that back into balance. As part of our commitment, we're also developing a biomass strategy, so how we can work with the agricultural industry to use some of the byproducts of animal farming practices to turn that into new forms of energy. And so there are a couple of effective measures there. Speaking personally, I think what we need to think about is how we educate people around climate footprints broadly and the choices they make as consumers. I'm sure there aren't many people who perhaps have the same appreciation of the impact of livestock on our planet in terms of its carbon footprint. And so I think better community education, better information to allow people to understand those things as part of their decision process when they're making choices about the types of protein they consume, I think an also useful thing to consider going forward.
The irony is I was speaking with a local business just today, the chef and the butcher, ironically at Harris Farm, and I had the very real question with her as a butcher, the concern about meat and the production and the impact on climate change. For someone in her industry for 25 years, she impressed upon me how many measures she's putting in place in terms of educating clients and customers to understand the impact, to make wise choices, that it's about quality, not quantity, to support sustainable farming, support the farmers and the producers that are taking proactive action, and be discerning as customers. There's a long way to go. It's a difficult industry to change. It's not going to be at a fast rate because it is hard to change habits and to change understandings. I know my son in primary school had to do a project of what impact you could do on climate change, and he came up with a project of Meat-Free Monday. Now, when he calculated what across a school with the number of families and the number of people per family, that impact that would have on carbon emission, he was absolutely blown away by what the impact of such a simple measure could have. Now, people within the industry support measures of being more discerning and for Australians to be more educated when it comes to those choices. And I think it is something we can all work towards and work together in making improvements.
Let me just say generally, I don't think I've ever been on a panel which I've enjoyed so much. Without fear of contradiction, I've gone to lots of different election campaign panels. This is the highest calibre panel I've ever heard. I'd be happy if any one of you won, and I love the fact that humans are either motivated by fear or hope. The CEO of Cambridge Analytica told us this in a sting by the Panorama, like it's the BBC program. He said, we just make up the facts, don't worry about that. He said, we micro-target messages of fear or hope, because we have bought Facebook, we know more about people than they or their spouses or partners know about themselves. That really struck me, that so much of our politics is actually about fear. When you get to hope, there are solutions, which is what I'm hearing tonight. Look, we all know, I think Meat-Free Monday is a brilliant idea. I think we all know grain-fed cattle, not to mention emissions, is really meaning that a whole lot of the world doesn't get fed. It's not particularly good for our health, our meat consumption. We know at a whole lot of levels, if there is an incremental step like a Meat-Free Monday, that's hope. Rather than fear, they're going to take away my love of a steak, which is the all or nothing fear. So I support what's being said.
So I'm going to ask some more questions from the floor, and a lot of the questions were around offshore detention. So what is your position, or your party's position, when it comes to offshore detention? Do you support it? And what do you believe should happen to those people who are still in offshore detention? This is open to anyone.
It probably goes without saying, as a Greens candidate, I'm categorically opposed to it. But as I said before, it's for deeply personal reasons that I've done pro bono work and filed High Court proceedings for asylum seekers who have been brought to Australia from Nauru. And I think when you understand what it's like on Nauru, it becomes clear why it's as a policy is deeply inhumane. They've told me terrible things about, women being sexually assaulted by people paid for by the Australian government. Children living in black mouldy tents in stifling heat with inadequate food and showering facilities. This isn't what human dignity looks like. And it reflects the kind of the mischief of offshore detention, which is the out of sight, out of mind problem. When asylum seekers are people living in your community, you know, when you're on the bus and you see the Tibetan community on the B1 to DY, it's not an abstract problem, other people's suffering and their humanity, but when it's some random person in an island detention centre who's been framed as someone who's just an opportunist, it becomes a lot easier to dissociate the consequences of our policies. As I said before, we do need a regional solution. I don't want people coming to Australia unsafely by boat. If we have rigorous policies so that people have a safe pathway to seek help, I don't think that they will come by boat. And we've already seen that boat turnbacks and offshore detention policies are not effective deterrents. Despite these policies, people have kept trying to come to Australia by boat. We've had a never-ending stream of people who need to seek asylum. So to some degree, we need to accept that these cruel policies have no real impact on whether people come to Australia or not, and actually be part of a constructive and humane solution, rather than kind of giving in to the kind of mean lizard part of our brain that kind of wants to hoard resources from people who aren't exactly like us.
I'll start first with the people that are currently still on Manus Nauru, and I'm talking both on behalf of the party and myself here. I think it's appalling that we still have people in indefinite detention in those places. It is dehumanising, and we are a better nation than that. The Labor Party will firstly accept New Zealand's generous offer to resettle 150 of those people. And as a matter of priority, we want to find other partner countries to, as soon as possible, get all of the people off Manus and Nauru. Mandatory detention, not indefinite, but mandatory detention does remain part of Labor's framework for trying to prevent people taking an unsafe journey. It's designed to stop people smugglers effectively taking advantage of desperate people in need. And we feel it is still an important part of the mix. I personally hope that not one person ever goes to offshore detention ever again. And I think the party feels the same way. We're investing in the UNHCR. We're investing in working with our immediate neighbours to find regional solutions. Already, people assessed for asylum, I think the vast majority of them are actually flown here today. And I and the party want that to be the preferred mode by which people that we take through our humanitarian intake come to Australia for resettlement. But nevertheless, there are people, smugglers, that still exist, that still operate, that are still looking to take advantage of people in countries like Indonesia. And so offshore detention and boat turnbacks when it's safe to do so will remain part of our framework, part of a holistic approach to try and minimise the effect of those people bringing people unsafely to our shores once again.
It's amazing. I mean, there's only one issue I think that's been more polarising and more of a political football than climate change, and it's probably our immigration policy and detention of refugees. I think the strength and the importance of an independent crossbench was highlighted recently with the Medivac bill introduced by Dr. Phelps. Now, it showed the power of actually trying to put some common sense into the action we can take in relation to refugees, introducing the concept that the medical care of people should actually be in the hands of doctors and shouldn't be a question for the minister. Now, the debate got horribly politicised as per usual, I think, as we've seen in the last 10 years or so, and ended up being used for all sorts of fear-mongering. As you've said, fear is ultimately what's used rather than having a common sense debate. I must say, it always beggars belief when that debate goes down that road. But the reality is both parties have been responsible for maintaining offshore detention and it's indefinite detention. And then that needs to be those parameters around how long does it take for processing, and there has to be minimum standards met. It simply can't go on that we have indefinite detention. But it's important when we talk about refugees and how treatment is, what are our local organisations doing? And we do have a number of fantastic organisations assisting refugees in our local communities, and they need some focus. So much of the debate is focused on Manus and Nauru, and I think we need to start embracing the more positive aspect of what we can truly do.
Look, I agree with most of what's said, and the only thing that I'd like to contribute is that we need to put women in charge. Where is our compassion? When do we recognise people as human beings? And when we lock them up in that way and we don't allow them to come to this safe land, you want to start talking about boat people? Again, the borders were always open. So if women were in charge, they wouldn't be allowing their babies that grow up to be adults to be treated in such a way. And I think we really need to look at our humanity when we do that to our fellow human beings. They are our neighbours. They are people who are seeking a safe land, and we need to be able to provide a safe place for them to come to.
So bringing some of these big global issues, I guess, to a more local level, thinking about the massacre in New Zealand, what steps would you take to discourage racism and fear and promote the welcoming of various cultural and religious groups in our community? It's again open to anyone.
Well, well, it goes actually to my very first point I made in the opening remarks. So I think, recognition and acknowledgement and an embrace for diversity is the starting point in any relationship. Looking at somebody for who they are and not sort of imposing our own sort of frame. And so I think we can go a long way in the way, certainly within our education system, about raising awareness, building understanding, building empathy for cultural and ethnic diversity within our own country. And I think if we can nurture and grow that sense of embrace for people who are not like us, but celebrating that diversity and that difference, I think we go a long way toward being able to move forward as a nation in the way that we've talked about tonight.
When that news broke, it was gut-wrenching, because once again, man was doing it to man. And fear, as you were saying before, breeds such evilness within society. And when someone doesn't look like us, when someone doesn't have the same spiritual belief as us, then we other them and we treat them differently. So I think we need to look at ourselves as Australians, because we're exporting now. I think we need to look at the way the press and the media play into this. I think we need to look at the way in which politics has played into this and the fear that goes within our communities. When do we see humans as our fellow human beings? We all belong to the human race, and when we kill each other in that way because of difference, I can tell you about that. And it's not nice when you get othered. So when do we start to have empathy and compassion for people? When do we grow that within our communities? Are we teaching this to our children, and are we raising good adults?
I mean, there's no doubt we all agree with those statements, but the reality is we do actually also need to take action. I think one of the things we all applauded so much, and not just in Australia but around the world, was how promptly New Zealand and Jacinda Ardern as the Prime Minister took action and took real action to do that. Now, I think Australia has in the past acted promptly as well when it's come to tightening gun laws, but the reality is our political discourse has dropped to a fairly low level. I think in general in Australia, hate speech and the rise of extreme opinions and the rise of how those opinions and views are used to political advantage and they're manipulated, I think that has not raised, it's only lowered the bar. And I think Warringah has in part contributed to that through our current representation. What we need is real action. And that means actually legislative action. We actually need to change the standard we expect. So my call would certainly be to the government of the day that we need to introduce legislation like minimum truth in political advertising, because that means you can't just slander the other side without basis. There has to be some standards applied. We need a National Anti-Corruption Commission. So again, we raise the standard. If we can raise the standard of our political discussion on every topic, then we can raise the standard and lower the risk when it comes to hate speech.
I think a lot of our political and media discourse has become very mean. Within America, talking about Make America Great Again. We have other parties in Australia talking about making Australia great again. This kind of romanticisation of a past that never really existed. I think if we should aspire to anything rather than to greatness, it should be to kindness and to empathy and to being a country that is led by values, not by meanness. So I think part of that is through how we as citizens consume media. We can't reward media outlets that bank on hate. There are too many media sources that sell papers on the basis of hate. And through our consumer dollar, we have to stop contributing to the success of those papers and instead reward media sources that have fair and balanced and empathetic reporting. We also have to do this through the way that we vote. There are some parties who run on platforms of division and hatred, othering people and saying who has a place in Australia. And we don't have to vote for those parties. We can vote with our hearts. We can vote for parties and for candidates who support a big Australia in the sense of having a big and open heart and having welcoming attitudes towards people and difference and accepting that we aren't a monoculture in Australia. We have many different types of people. We have a 60,000-year-old history, and we have new migrants whose history in Australia has only just begun. And there's a place for all of these people in Australia rather than, as I said, indulging in the kind of mean lizard brain that wants to hoard resources, but think with empathy and with compassion and with our brains as well. But sometimes our brains can deceive us about what the most logical course of action is. But I think if we orient our politics on how Australia can be a better place for everyone, not just the privileged few, then I think that it would be much harder for us to be led astray and to put a step wrong.
I think they are wonderful reflections, and after Christchurch and particularly watching Jacinda Ardern and her leadership, I thought, could Australia just become a dependency of New Zealand and she be our Prime Minister? So I agree with all that's been said, and I think the narratives and stories we tell ourselves really do have to be thought through. Even though I was negative about the world retribalising, because I fear it leads to nationalism and superiority and othering, there is a real issue that humans are tribal by instinct, and at one level we do need tribes. We want the dignity of difference with Indigenous tribes and with my Irish history and that sense that there are people who will laugh at my jokes because they're my tribe, they get my humour. They'll be there when I'm alone. They are my mob. So we have this interesting balancing issue to say, how do we celebrate the dignity of difference and have a sense of place and mob and belonging without it then leading to my mob is superior and othering others? And I think A study done after the Holocaust, commissioned by Jews, just asked the question, why were there some, there were few, righteous Gentiles who were so different to the collaborators and the fear of the others under the Nazis? They stood up, they hid Jews, they risked their own lives. And the main discovery was the righteous Gentiles were people who did not treat Jews as an abstraction. They actually had neighbours, colleagues, friends who they knew as real people, which is, I think, the real challenge to us. How many Muslims do we know? How many have been into our homes? How are we going beyond abstraction, whilst at the same time celebrating the dignity of our mob, because as humans we do need that sense of belonging.
Well, that brings us almost to the end of our time together, but I'm going to invite each candidate again to give a 2-minute closing remark. We're going to start again with you, Kristyn.
I'm running in this election because I believe in compassion guiding our politics, compassion for our fellow man, compassion for our planet and the living things which inhabit it. I believe that Warringah shares my passion for a collaborative and compassionate vision of what politics could be like. During the last 2 terms of Parliament, there's been a meanness of political culture that has permeated that just does not sit well with me. And I actually felt morally I couldn't continue without being able to put my hand on heart and say that I had done everything that I could to try and change that political discourse in my local area. I think at times this meanness is characterised or labelled as, racism or discrimination or sexism, but I think we can boil it down to actually something a lot more generalisable. It's a lack of empathy and kindness for difference. And our political discourse isn't the only place where meanness has reigned. In 2018, the highest 1% of Australians earned as much in a fortnight as the lowest 5% receives in a whole year. The wealthiest 20% of Australians own nearly 2/3 of all wealth, while the lowest half own just 18%. I don't think our economy is one that gives people a fair go anymore, because there's nothing fair about this at all. Our economic system is seeking never-ending profits and to put the resources of our constrained planet into the ever-increasing hands of the few. So I think our economy and our society needs to reorient its principles to put the environment and people first. I think that there is a common value to both what I see as being Green's principles and Christian values, as I was educated in the Christian schooling system, which is an idea of compassion guiding our moral philosophy and our outlook towards the world. And so I encourage you to vote with compassion and to prioritise candidates who have genuine compassion shining through their economic and environmental policies.
This is a very important election, the one that's coming in the next 5 or perhaps 6 weeks. It's an election where we need to change representation in Warringah, but it's also an election where we need to change the government. We need to change the government because the current government have led us away from our international obligations. They've encouraged us to step back from providing an appropriate level of foreign development assistance to our regional neighbours. They've also encouraged us to think of people, to trade in the politics of fear and division, as opposed to bringing us together as a nation with our neighbours toward a brighter future. They're also a government that's fundamentally in denial of the need to act on climate change. We've seen that. Their track record is clear. Emissions have continued to rise under this government over the last 5 years, and we all know in this room and on this panel that we need to rapidly transform our economy and our society so that we're reducing emissions to that level that will keep global warming below 2 degrees. So it's a critical election, and I would encourage you to think very carefully, to really understand the policy differences between each of the candidates on the stage here tonight, and to choose a candidate or a party that you feel will be able to act not only in your interests and in the interests of the people of Warringah, but in the interests of our nation and in the interests of our regional neighbours. And so with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and your time, and I would encourage you to consider the Labor Party as a party that has the policies, has the united team, has the capability to act and deliver on the outcomes that we've talked about tonight. It's a party that's ready to form government, and I'm delighted to represent that party this evening.
I must say, it has been a really stimulating and really interesting discussion tonight. And for me, there's one really overwhelming question that comes up. It's what kind of Australia do we want to be, and what kind of Warringah do we want to be? Looking to the future and thinking about all the discussions, I think Australia and Warringah has the opportunity to be a leader on many issues that impact us nationally, regionally and globally. Now, locally, we have amazing organisations doing great work, far above what I think we're doing as a nation in terms of our overall aid. For example, Northern Beaches Refugee Sanctuary, based in Queenscliff, has helped refugees from over 40 countries since they started in 2003. We've got a number of organisations like the Salvation Army and St Vincent de Paul, who are all also helping refugees locally. But now, how can we lead the way in helping our neighbouring countries with humanitarian and development challenges through healthy, targeted aid? We can lead the way on improving conditions and protection for refugees in our region while maintaining strong border protection. We can lead the way by ensuring refugees are not forced to sit for 5 or more years in institutions while waiting to be processed. We can do better than this, and we've got the opportunity to do that. By leading the way on commitments, we can foster a future for our regional neighbours, where refugees are afforded basic legal protection. They're treated with compassion, and they have a clearer resettlement options, and they won't risk their lives. This in turn will safeguard our national security and our interests. Now, as a member of a UN Security Council, we must be global leaders on climate change. This means focusing on women's education in developing nations. It is a huge contributing factor to climate change. And the more we focus on our Australian aid abroad, the more we take care of a number of issues, our humanitarian and compassion, but importantly, our climate change and our future. Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight.
I guess I'm a bit the same. I stepped into this because I'm a justice seeker. I search for the truth in who we are as Australians. And an uncomfortable truth that perhaps rings true for many of you was written up by someone who's present here tonight, Matt Davis. And he wrote a blog on the Misha website, which I want to read to you because I think there are some truths that we need to actually bring to the fore. Matt said, and I quote, "I've been privileged to visit more than 30 countries across 6 of the world's 7 continents. I've been immersed in the rich tapestries of their unique cultures and traditions. From Karen tribes in the hills of Thailand to the Maasai villages on the savannah of Kenya. I've picked up the cause of justice in advocating for child workers in India's brick kilns, desperate mothers fleeing for their lives as refugees escaping the Congo, and a more robust Australian aid program. But in the nation I call home, I'm ashamed to say I've hardly lifted a finger. Or perhaps more importantly, turned a proper listening ear. When it comes to my understanding of the culture, traditions and struggles of our First Nations people, which continue today, what could I do to describe as the surface, what I do would be described as surface level at best. But I don't think I'm alone. Why is that? Why is it that in many of our churches we have pin boards highlighting our great work abroad, along with reasonable budgets, committees, and in some denominations even entire months given over to focus on overseas missions? But by and large, we haven't eschewed the work of reconciliation, justice and closing the gap of disadvantage that exists between Indigenous Australians and other Australians, end quote. So I ask you, when will you see us? When will you hear our voices? When will you love us as your neighbour? I believe charity begins at home. Once we have our home in order, we will have so much more to share here and abroad, and we will find the unity in our community.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, can we thank our panel and put our hands together? You just stopped, but put your hands together for Tim Costello, Zali Steggall, Susan Moylan-Coombs, Dean Harris and Kristyn Glanville.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody. We've come towards the end of our evening tonight, and like Tim, I am so encouraged by what I have heard. I think I see tonight's gathering as a small step towards mobilising a compassionate movement in Warringah, where we use our collective voice and influence as residents and also as candidates to progress a more generous and neighbourly nation. I think that life is just going to get a whole lot busier for these people on this stage over the next few weeks. Can I encourage you to continue to support and engage with our candidates? You can do that in other community forums, and climate change is an issue that keeps coming up. And on 15th of April in Mossman, there is another candidates forum run by the Voices for Warringah. And can I also encourage you that as a church and with Micah Australia, we are going to continue to gather and mobilise around these issues. If you would like to know more about the policy Ask for Micah, you can find out about that as you leave this evening. So finally, some thanks from Seaforth Baptist Church. A big shout out to Stella Mara School, who kindly donates this theatre to us to run this forum tonight. And a shout out to Mick at the back. Thank you, Stella Maris. A thank you to each and every one of you that's made the time to be here tonight. But finally, a thank you to our candidates. We want to encourage you to do all you can as you represent us to help build a better, fairer and better future for all of us in Warringah. Thank you to all of you for being here tonight. Can I encourage the media, if you would like to have a comment from the candidates this evening, to come to the front of the stage. And I'm going to ask the Reverend Tim Costello, if you will close for us, Tim, bring us home in Warringah with some good prayer.
Okay, let's pray. We thank you for this nation being blessed. We thank you that for all of us, we have won that first lottery in the first ticket in the lottery of latitude, that we have clean water, we have universal health and education. We do know there are many homeless. There is a gap between black and white Australia. There are huge challenges, but still we know we are blessed. We thank you for the spirit of this community, and I, above all, want to thank you for the calibre and the vision of each of these candidates. And we pray this in your name. Amen.